Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They were slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. They were also celebrities, sex symbols, and heroes whose names were scratched into walls by admirers across the Roman Empire. They lived in chains but could earn more than senators. They were legally classified as infamous, utterly without honor or standing, yet emperors sought their company, and noble women risked everything for secret liaisons with them. They embodied death, but represented the very vitality of Rome itself. These were the gladiators, and their existence was perhaps the strangest contradiction in all of ancient history. Tonight, we will journey into the heart of this paradox, descending through layers of blood-soaked sand into the complex reality of Rome's most infamous entertainment. We'll stand in the shadows of funeral pyres where it all began, feel the weight of wooden training swords in gladiator schools, and sit among 50,000 screaming spectators as men and women fight for their lives and their freedom. This is not merely a story of violence and spectacle, though both were undeniably present. This is the story of how a civilization transformed ritual murder into art, slavery into stardom, and death into the very pulse of empire. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel the veil between past and present, growing thin as we cross into the year 80 AD, where morning sunlight slants through the barred window of a cell beneath the great Flavian amphitheatre. The air is thick with the scent of leather, sweat, and the peculiar mixture of oil and sand that every gladiator knows by heart. Today, perhaps, someone will die. Today, perhaps, someone will win their freedom. Marcus, we'll call him Marcus, though his real name is lost to history, rises from his simple straw mattress in the darkness before dawn. His movements are precise, ritualistic, practiced over 3 years of captivity and training. First, he checks his body for signs of weakness or injury, running calloused hands over scars that map a geography of survival. The deep gash across his left shoulder from his first real fight, when terror nearly cost him everything. The puckered wound on his thigh from Retiarius's trident that found its mark but failed to cripple. Each mark tells a story, and each story ends the same way. He lived, someone else did not. The paradox of Marcus's existence would have been immediately apparent to any Roman citizen, yet few stopped to consider its strangeness. He was property, owned by his lanista, his trainer, and master, as surely as any cow or cart. His life could be bought, sold, or ended at another's whim. The law considered him so far beneath ordinary citizens that free Romans who voluntarily became gladiators, the octorati, underwent a ceremonial death, a complete surrender of their legal personhood. They ceased to exist as human beings in the eyes of the state. Yet this same non-person, this walking corpse in legal terms, would today enter an arena where senators' wives would crane their necks to catch a glimpse of his oiled muscles gleaming in the sunday. Children would chant his name. Poets would compose verses about his victories. His image would be scratched into tavern walls and painted on bedroom frescoes. Pottery lamps would bear his likeness, and mothers would name their sons after him, hoping to capture some fragment of his deadly glory. The contradiction went deeper still. Roman society prized virtus, courage, excellence, and martial prowess above almost all other qualities. The gladiator embodied these virtues in their purest form, displaying them not in distant battlefields but right before the citizens' eyes. Every fight was a philosophical demonstration, a living lesson in how to face death with dignity. The Stoic philosophers who dominated Roman intellectual life could hardly have asked for better examples of their teachings about accepting fate with equanimity. Yet these same exemplars of Roman values were excluded from Roman society, banned from proper burial in consecrated ground forbidden from giving legal testimony, unable to leave property in a valid will. Etruscan shadows, the funeral origins. To understand how Rome arrived at this extraordinary contradiction, we must travel back 4 centuries before Marcus's mourning preparations to the elaborate tombs that dot the hills of Etruria, north of Rome. Here, among a civilization that preceded and profoundly influenced the Romans, death was not an ending but a transformation requiring proper ceremonies, proper offerings, and most importantly, proper blood. The Etruscans believed that the spirits of the dead required sustenance for their journey to the afterlife. Not symbolic sustenance, but real vitality drawn from living blood. When an important person died, their funeral rites included the sacrifice of prisoners captured in war. Their blood poured onto the ground to strengthen the deceased's ghost. These killings were ritualistic, purposeful, and deeply religious. The victim's death served a cosmic function, maintaining the balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Somewhere in the mists of early history, the exact moment is lost. Someone introduced a variation. Instead of simply executing prisoners, why not have them fight each other? The blood would still flow, the dead would still receive their offering, but there would be an added element: competition, struggle, the display of courage in the face of certain death. The survivors, if any emerged, had proven themselves worthy through combat. They had earned, through blood and skill, a temporary reprieve from fate. The Romans encountered this practice as they absorbed Etruscan culture during their early expansion. Like so many foreign customs that caught their fancy, they adapted it, transformed it, and made it distinctly their own. The first recorded gladiatorial games in Rome occurred in 264 BC, when the sons of Junius Brutus Pera honoured their father's funeral with 3 pairs of gladiators fighting in the cattle market. 3 pairs, 6 men, fighting to sanctify one patrician's journey to the afterlife. Within a generation, the numbers had multiplied. By 216 BC, the 3 sons of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus celebrated their father's death with 22 pairs of gladiators fighting over 3 days. The funeral of Publius Licinius in 183 BC featured 60 pairs. The escalation was not merely quantitative but qualitative. What had begun as a solemn religious rite was developing elaborate rules, specialized equipment, and distinct fighting styles. The transformation from sacred ritual to public entertainment happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Romans began to anticipate important funerals, not for the opportunity to mourn, but for the chance to witness combat. Ambitious politicians recognized an opportunity. By sponsoring elaborate funeral games for their relatives, sometimes relatives who had died years earlier, they could win popular favor. The religious pretext grew thinner with each passing decade, a translucent veil barely concealing raw political ambition. Consider the genius of this evolution. In most societies, blood sports and human sacrifice were hidden, conducted in secret, or restricted to special ceremonies. Rome took these dark impulses and placed them at the center of public life, transforming them into a tool of statecraft. The games became a conversation between the powerful and the masses, conducted in the language of blood. Through them, the elite demonstrated their wealth, their power over life and death, and their generosity in sharing spectacular entertainment with the common people. You stand at the graveside. You stand in the Roman Forum on a grey morning in 264 BC. The September air carries the acrid smoke of funeral pyres, mixing with the earthier scents of cattle and unwashed humanity that permanently permeate this heart of the growing city. You've come to pay respects to Junius Brutus Pera, a man of considerable importance whose sons have promised something unprecedented to honour his memory. The crowd presses close around you, a mixture of patricians in their white togas with purple borders and plebeians in rougher tunics of undyed wool. Everyone has heard rumours, about what the Brutus brothers have planned. Prisoners of war, they whisper, Samnites and companions, captured in the recent fighting, will shed blood for the dead man's spirit. But not in the traditional way of a quick sacrifice. Something different, something new. The funeral rites proceed with practiced solemnity. The professional mourners wail their stylized lamentations, their voices rising and falling in ancient patterns that make your skin prickle with primordial recognition. The sons deliver their eulogies, recounting their father's victories, his service to Rome, his embodiment of traditional virtues. Incense burns in bronze braziers, its sweet smoke meant to carry prayers to the gods above and the spirits below. Then the space clears. Slaves quickly mark out a rough square in the packed earth, perhaps 20 paces on each side. The crowd instinctively forms a circle, and you find yourself pushed forward by the mass of bodies behind you, close enough to see everything that's about to unfold. Your heart beats faster, though you're not entirely sure what you're about to witness. They bring out 6 men, 3 pairs of prisoners shackled at the wrists. They're Samnites. You can tell by their distinctive helmets with high crests and the rectangular shields they're given. Someone has provided them with swords, not the wooden training weapons of military drill, but real gladii, their steel edges catching the weak morning light. The prisoners' faces show a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning comprehension. They understand they're going to die. What they don't yet understand is that they have a chance to determine how an official, perhaps one of the Brutus sons, though the crowd makes it hard to see clearly, speaks words you can't quite hear over the murmuring spectators. But the gesture is clear enough. The shackles are removed. The pairs are separated to opposite ends of the fighting space, and then, with no more ceremony than that, they're commanded to fight. The first moments are awkward, almost embarrassing. These men are warriors, yes, but they're not accustomed to single combat as performance. They circle each other warily, testing the weight of unfamiliar swords, trying to gauge whether this is real or some elaborate Roman trick. Then one makes a tentative thrust, another parries, and suddenly the reality crashes upon them. This is real. The crowd wants blood, and only one of them might survive. Your mouth goes dry as the fight intensifies. The clash of metal on metal rings across the forum. One Samnite drives another back with a series of powerful overhand blows that send sparks flying from their colliding blades. You can see the strain on their faces, the sweat already streaming despite the cool morning. This is nothing like the organized battles these men knew, with their formations and signals and the comfort of brothers in arms beside them. This is intimate, personal, inescapable, from sacred rite to public spectacle. The transformation you witnessed that day in the forum, though you could not have known it at the time, represented a pivotal moment in the development of Western civilization's relationship with violence as entertainment. What began as a religious offering would, over the succeeding centuries, evolve into the most sophisticated system of death as spectacle the world had ever seen. The religious framework provided essential cover for what might otherwise have been seen as mere bloodlust. Romans could tell themselves that munera, the term for gladiatorial games, literally meaning duties or offerings, were acts of pietas, of proper devotion to deceased ancestors. This fiction became increasingly transparent as the games grew more elaborate and less connected to actual funerals, but it never entirely disappeared. Even at the height of the imperial period, when gladiatorial combats were openly acknowledged as entertainment, a residual religious vocabulary clung to them like morning mist on the Tiber. Political exploitation of the games accelerated during the late Republic, that tumultuous period when the traditional structures of Roman governance buckled under the weight of empire. Julius Caesar, ever the innovator in matters of popular manipulation, presented games featuring 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor a spectacle so lavish that the Senate, alarmed at such obvious courting of mob favour, passed legislation limiting the number of gladiators any individual could maintain in Rome. The justifications for the games multiplied and evolved. They were not merely religious offerings, but educational tools, demonstrating to Roman citizens the superiority of their martial culture. Watching barbarians and criminals die in the arena reinforced Roman identity, reminding spectators of their privileged position in the cosmic order. The games became a form of justice, with condemned criminals meeting their ends, not in dark prison cells, but in the full light of public scrutiny. They were also, paradoxically, instruments of mercy. A defeated gladiator who fought well might receive missio, reprieve, and live to fight another day. This possibility of redemption through combat aligned perfectly with Roman values. But perhaps the most ingenious transformation was the development of gladiatorial combat as art form. What had been crude butchery in those early funeral games evolved into a highly technical display of martial skill. Different types of gladiators emerged, each with distinctive equipment and fighting styles designed to create compelling matchups. The retiarius with his net and trident faced the secutor with his smooth helmet and large shield. The Thraex, with his curved sword, challenged the Murmillo with his straight blade. These were not random pairings, but carefully crafted encounters, each designed to showcase different aspects of combat and create maximum dramatic tension. The aesthetic dimension of gladiatorial combat cannot be overstated. Romans discussed famous fights with the analytical precision of art critics. They debated the merits of different styles, the courage displayed by particular fighters, the technical excellence of specific moves. Graffiti from Pompeii records detailed statistics of gladiators' victories and defeats, the ancient equivalent of modern sports analytics. The games had become simultaneously a religious ritual, a political tool, a justice system, an educational display, and a form of high art. The economics of blood, behind the spectacle, beneath the sand that absorbed so much blood, a vast economic machinery, hummed with ruthless efficiency. The business of death was, above all, a business, and like any successful enterprise in Rome, it operated according to strict commercial principles that would be familiar to any modern entertainment executive. The Lanistae, the men who owned and trained gladiators, occupied a peculiar position in Roman society. They were simultaneously essential and despised, wealthy and infamous. The law classified them alongside pimps and actors as practitioners of disreputable professions, yet their services were indispensable to any politician seeking popular favour. A successful lanista might own hundreds of gladiators, each representing a significant capital investment that had to be carefully managed and maximised. Consider the economics of a single gladiator. First came the initial purchase price, which varied dramatically based on the source and potential of the human commodity. A strong prisoner of war might cost 2,000 sesterces, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual earnings. A condemned criminal could be acquired for much less, perhaps 500 sesterces, but required more training and carried higher risk of early death. Some lanistae specialized in purchasing slaves deemed unsuitable for other work. The rebellious, the violent, the uncontrollable, gambling that traits that made them poor agricultural laborers might make them excellent gladiators. Then came the investment in training. A gladiator required at least 6 months of intensive instruction before he could perform creditably in the arena, and the best fighters trained for years. During this time, he had to be fed a special diet heavy in barley. Gladiators were sometimes mockingly called hordearii, barley eaters, which built the layer of subcutaneous fat that protected vital organs from superficial wounds. Medical care was essential and expensive. A talented physician like Galen who began his career treating gladiators in Pergamon, commanded substantial fees. Equipment, though often provided by the game's sponsors, still required maintenance and replacement. The mathematics of profit were complex and often brutal. A gladiator, who died in his first fight, represented a total loss of investment. One who survived multiple encounters became increasingly valuable, commanding higher fees for appearances. The most successful gladiators, those who survived 20 or 30 fights, could earn their purchase price back many times over, yet they also became increasingly expensive to maintain, demanding better food, private cells, and sometimes even servants of their own. The rental market for gladiators operated with surprising sophistication. Contracts specified exact terms. The editor, or sponsor of the games, would pay a rental fee for each gladiator's appearance, plus compensation for any who were killed or permanently maimed. Prices varied by experience and type. A veteran Murmillo might command 5,000 sesterces for a single appearance, while a novice might rent for only 500. Death compensation could reach 50 times the rental fee, ensuring that editors had financial incentive to avoid unnecessary fatalities. This economic reality created an unexpected dynamic in the arena. Contrary to popular modern perception, most gladiatorial fights did not end in death. Scholars estimate that in the 1st century AD, only about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 defeated gladiators was actually killed. The economics simply didn't support higher mortality rates. Dead gladiators generated no future revenue, and the compensation costs could bankrupt all but the wealthiest sponsors. The crowd might bay for blood, but the accountants' ledgers often argued for mercy. The secondary economy around gladiatorial games was equally impressive. Betting on fights moved enormous sums through Roman bookmakers. Vendors sold food, wine, and souvenirs to spectators. Prostitutes worked the crowds before and after events. Artists crafted figurines, lamps, and mosaics depicting famous fighters. Poets and writers found patronage, composing odes to victories or epitaphs for the defeated. Physicians developed new techniques for treating combat wounds. Morticians specialized in handling arena casualties. An entire economic ecosystem evolved around the fundamental transaction of violence as entertainment. Marcus Attilius, the free man who chose slavery. Among all the stories scratched into pottery shards and preserved in graffiti, few capture the paradox of gladiatorial life more perfectly than that of Marcus Attilius, a freeborn Roman citizen who voluntarily surrendered his liberty to fight in the arena. We know him from inscriptions found in Pompeii, where his victories were recorded with the enthusiasm modern fans might show for a sports hero. M. Attilius, Tiro, Vicit, Hilarus, Neronianus, X14, Missus, Marcus, Attilius. Novice, victorious, Hilarus from Nero's school, 14 victories, reprieved. In his first professional fight, this rookie defeated a veteran with 14 wins, a feat roughly equivalent to an amateur boxer defeating a reigning champion in his debut. What drives a free man to undergo the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, the gladiator's oath? The words of this oath, preserved by the writer Petronius, are chilling in their totality. I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. This was not merely rhetorical flourish. By speaking these words, the volunteer gladiator, the auctorati, legally ceased to be a person. He became property, subject to his master's absolute authority, stripped of every right that defined Roman citizenship. Marcus Attilius likely had debts. This was the most common reason free men entered the arena, a last desperate gamble to escape financial ruin. The signing bonus for a volunteer gladiator could reach 2,000 sesterces, enough to satisfy creditors and perhaps save a family from destitution. But the price was total submission, a form of social death that many Romans considered worse than physical death. Yet something extraordinary happened to Marcus Atilius in the arena. His second recorded fight was against Lucius Ratius Felix, another veteran with 12 victories. Again, the novice won, and again his defeated opponent was granted missio, reprieve. The crowd had witnessed something special, not just victory, but artistry. Marcus Atilius had that ineffable quality that transforms a fighter into a champion, a gladiator into a legend. His story illuminates a crucial truth about the arena. It was one of the few venues in Roman society where talent could transcend legal status. In the amphitheatre, a slave who fought with exceptional skill earned more respect than a free citizen who showed cowardice. The sand of the arena was a great leveller, where social hierarchies temporarily dissolved in the face of pure martial ability. This democratization of glory, limited and violent though it was, gave the games a unique appeal across all strata of Roman society. Architecture of death, birth of the amphitheatre, the evolution of gladiatorial venues from temporary wooden structures to permanent stone amphitheatres, parallels the transformation of the games themselves from occasional religious rites to regular public entertainment. This architectural development was not merely functional but deeply symbolic, representing Rome's commitment to institutionalized violence as a cornerstone of civic life. The earliest gladiatorial combats took place wherever space could be cleared, in forums, marketplaces, or circus grounds designed for chariot racing. Temporary wooden bleachers were erected for important games, creating improvised arenas that were dismantled once the blood was washed away. These structures were notoriously dangerous. In 27 AD, a wooden amphitheatre in Fidenae collapsed during a gladiatorial show, killing or injuring thousands of spectators, more casualties than many military battles. The first permanent stone amphitheatre was not built in Rome but in Pompeii, around 70 BC. Its sponsors, the magistrates Gaius, Quinctius, Valgus, and Marcus Porcius, were responding to local demand for a dedicated venue for blood sports. The structure they created established the basic architectural template that would be replicated across the empire, an oval arena surrounded by rising tiers of seats, with underground passages for moving fighters, animals, and equipment. The genius of amphitheatre design lay in its solution to fundamental crowd control problems. How do you move 50,000 people in and out of a venue efficiently? How do you maintain social hierarchies in seating while preventing disorder? How do you ensure clear sightlines for all spectators while maximizing capacity? Roman architects solved these challenges with innovations that modern stadium designers still admire. The seating arrangement was rigidly hierarchical. A three-dimensional map of Roman social structure, the emperor and senatorial class sat closest to the action in the Ima Cavea, on marble seats with their names carved into them. Behind them sat the equestrian order, the wealthy business class. Then came ordinary citizens, the plebs, subdivided by tribe and social standing. Women, except for the Vestal virgins, were relegated to the highest tiers, furthest from the arena. Slaves and non-citizens, if admitted at all, stood in the wooden galleries at the very top. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It reinforced social order, reminding everyone of their place in the Roman hierarchy. But it also created a collective experience, a temporary community united in witnessing spectacle. The senator and the shopkeeper might sit in different sections, but they gasped at the same reversals, cheered the same victories, and shared the same visceral excitement. The amphitheatre was simultaneously an instrument of social control and social cohesion. The underground areas, the hypogeum, represented perhaps the greatest architectural innovation. These subterranean chambers and corridors, hidden beneath the arena floor, contained elaborate machinery for staging spectacles. Elevators powered by counterweights and human muscle could lift gladiators, animals, or scenic elements into the arena at dramatic moments. Trapdoors allowed for sudden appearances and disappearances. Drainage systems could flood the arena for naval battles, or drain it quickly for land combat. Morning mist over Campania, dawn comes gently to the hills of Campania, 30 miles south of Naples, where the most famous gladiatorial schools of the empire nestle among vineyards and olive groves. The morning mist rises from the valleys like the breath of sleeping gods, softening the harsh edges of the training grounds, where men learn to kill with precision and die with dignity. The landscape here seems almost deliberately ironic in its beauty. Vesuvius looms to the north, its fertile slopes covered in grapevines that produce wine exported across the Mediterranean. The sea sparkles to the west, its trade winds carrying the scent of salt and possibility. Birds sing in the fruit trees that border the gladiatorial schools, their cheerful melodies a counterpoint to the clash of practice weapons that will soon fill the air. In this pastoral setting, 4 major ludi, gladiatorial schools, house nearly 2,000 fighters. The most prestigious is the Ludus Julianus, established by Julius Caesar himself and now imperial property. Its barracks are built around a central training ground, the architecture deliberately reminiscent of military camps. This is no accident. The Romans understood that discipline, routine, and esprit de corps were as essential to creating effective gladiators as physical conditioning. The morning routine begins before the sun crests the horizon. Slaves move through the dormitories, bringing water for washing and the first meal of the day, a porridge of barley and beans, flavoured with garum, the fermented fish sauce Romans added to everything. The diet is monotonous, but carefully calibrated. The barley builds bulk, creating the protective layer of fat that distinguishes gladiators from lean soldiers. Beans provide strength. Ash, surprisingly, is sometimes mixed into their food. Romans believed it strengthened bones. As the mist burns away under the rising sun, the soundscape of the ludus emerges. The rhythmic thud of wooden swords against practice posts. The harsh breathing of men, pushing their bodies to exhaustion. The barked commands of trainers, many of them former gladiators, who earned their freedom, but found no other trade than teaching others their deadly craft. And underneath it all, like a bass note, you feel more than hear, the constant awareness that this pastoral piece is preparation for metropolitan slaughter. The ludus, academy of violence. Within the walls of a gladiatorial school, a peculiar society existed, governed by rules that inverted normal Roman social structures, while simultaneously reinforcing the empire's fundamental values of discipline, hierarchy, and martial excellence. The ludus was equal parts prison, military academy, and athletic training facility, an institution with no real parallel in the ancient world. The physical layout of a typical ludus revealed its dual nature as both fortress and school. The perimeter walls stood 12 feet high, topped with iron spikes or pottery shards set in mortar, sufficient to discourage escape attempts without creating the impression of a true prison. After all, some gladiators were volunteers who had chosen this life, and even the enslaved fighters were valuable assets, requiring a degree of psychological management beyond mere physical confinement. Inside, the architecture followed a standardized plan, refined over generations. The central courtyard, perhaps 40 meters square, served as the primary training ground. Its surface was carefully maintained, sand mixed with sawdust, soft enough to cushion falls but firm enough to provide stable footing. Around this courtyard, covered colonnades provided shade for observing trainers and space for specialized instruction. The columns were often padded with leather and straw, serving as striking posts for practicing specific attacks. The dormitory cells lined the outer walls, small chambers typically housing 2 to 4 gladiators each. Veterans and successful fighters earned the privilege of single cells, a privacy that marked their elevated status within the gladiatorial hierarchy. New arrivals, the novitiates, shared cramped quarters where they learned their first lesson. In the ludus, everything, space, food, equipment, life itself, had to be earned through performance. The training regime was methodical and progressive, designed to transform raw recruits into precision fighters over months or years. Newcomers spent their first weeks learning to move in armor, building the specific muscle groups required for their assigned fighting style. A retiarius, destined to fight with net and trident, developed different physical attributes than a murmillo, with his heavy shield and helmet. The specialization was absolute. Once assigned a fighting style, a gladiator rarely changed it throughout his career. The doctores, trainers responsible for instruction, were typically retired gladiators who had survived long enough to earn their freedom. They possessed knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in the arena, and they guarded their secrets carefully. Each doctor specialized in a particular fighting style, passing down techniques refined over generations of mortal combat. Their teaching methods combined verbal instruction, demonstration, and countless hours of repetitive drill designed to make complex movements instinctive. Practice began with the palace, a thick wooden post that served as an opponent that never tired and never struck back. Gladiators would spend hours attacking this post with wooden swords twice the weight of real weapons, building strength while perfecting their technique. Only after mastering the palus did they progress to sparring with other gladiators, using wooden weapons and supervised by doctors who could stop dangerous situations before they escalated. The social dynamics within the ludus were complex and often surprising. Despite coming from different backgrounds, slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, volunteers, gladiators developed a strong collective identity. They called each other brother and formed familiae, gladiatorii, gladiatorial families bound by shared danger and mutual dependence. They knew that the man sleeping in the next cell might one day face them in the arena, yet they also knew that same man was their only ally in a world that simultaneously celebrated and despised them. This brotherhood extended even to death. Gladiators formed burial societies, contributing small amounts from their earnings to ensure proper funerals for fallen comrades. These collegia were among the few organizations that accepted gladiators as members, providing a semblance of dignity in death that society denied them in life. Inscriptions on gladiatorial tombstones often mention these societies, along with touching epitaphs from fellow fighters. To Spartacus, Secutor, 13 fights, died aged 22. From his familia gladiatoria, the psychological training was as important as the physical. Gladiators had to learn to control fear, to perform under the gaze of thousands, to maintain composure when wounded, and most crucially, to face death with the stoic dignity Romans expected. They practiced their death scenes, learning to die well if fate turned against them. A gladiator who begged for mercy or showed cowardice damaged not only his own reputation, but that of his entire ludus. Yet life in the ludus was not unremitting grimness. Successful gladiators enjoyed privileges unimaginable to ordinary slaves. They received fan mail, love letters from admirers, gifts from wealthy patrons. They were permitted conjugal visits from wives or lovers. Some maintained long-term relationships, fathering children who were born free despite their father's servile status. The most successful could accumulate significant wealth, owning property through peculium. The fund slaves could manage, though not legally own. Types and tribes, the gladiatorial pantheon, the genius of Roman entertainment lay not in simple bloodshed, but in the creation of a complex taxonomy of combat, a careful categorization of killing styles that transformed crude violence into sophisticated spectacle. By the 1st century AD, The gladiatorial system had evolved into approximately 20 distinct fighting classes, each with unique equipment, techniques, and tactical philosophies. These were not arbitrary divisions, but carefully calibrated matchups designed to create maximum dramatic tension while showcasing different aspects of martial skill. The evolution of these types followed a peculiar logic that combined practical combat experience with theatrical consideration. Early gladiators fought as their ethnic origins dictated: Samnites with their distinctive armor, Gauls with their long swords, Thracians with their curved blades. But as Rome's enemies were conquered and absorbed, these ethnic designations became problematic. One could hardly celebrate the submission of the Samnites while simultaneously cheering Samnite gladiators in the arena. Thus began the transformation from ethnic to functional categories, though traces of the original nomenclature persisted for centuries. The Murmillo emerged as the archetypal Roman gladiator, his very name possibly derived from the Greek word for a type of fish, reflected in the distinctive fish-shaped crest adorning his helmet. He carried the traditional legionary equipment, a large rectangular shield, the scutum, weighing nearly 20 pounds, and a straight stabbing sword, the gladius. His armour was substantial, a helmet that covered the entire head with only small eye holes, a manica or arm guard on his sword arm, and a single greave protecting his leading leg. The weight of this equipment, perhaps 40 pounds in total, meant the Murmillo relied on endurance and defensive technique rather than speed. Against the Murmillo, the editors often matched the Thracians, whose equipment evoked Rome's Thracian enemies. His most distinctive feature was the Sika, a curved sword designed to reach around an opponent's shield. The Thracian protected himself with a small square shield, the parmula, and wore greaves on both legs, necessary given his shield's limited coverage. His helmet featured a distinctive griffin crest, and the visual contrast between the heavily armoured Murmillo and the more agile Thracians created an immediately comprehensible narrative of strength versus speed. But the most visually striking gladiator was undoubtedly the retiarius, the net fighter who entered the arena looking more like a fisherman than a warrior. He wore almost no armour, just a manica on his left arm and a gallerus, a distinctive shoulder guard that protected his neck and head. His weapons were unique in the gladiatorial arsenal: a weighted net for entangling opponents, a trident for keeping them at distance, and a pugio, a small dagger for close combat. The retiarius represented pure offence, relying entirely on mobility and technique for survival. The natural opponent for the retiarius was the secutor, whose very name means pursuer. The secutor's equipment was specifically designed to counter the net fighter's advantages. His helmet was completely smooth, with no projections that could catch in the net, featuring only 2 small eye holes that protected against the trident's prongs, but severely limited vision. This created a fascinating dynamic. The secutor had to close quickly before exhaustion set in, while the retiarius needed to maintain distance and wait for his heavily armoured opponent to tire. The hoplomachus brought Greek military traditions into the arena, fighting with a long spear and a small round shield. His appearance was distinctive: a helmet with a tall crest, quilted leg wrappings, and a bronze greave on his leading leg. The hoplomachus faced a particular challenge. Once his spear was broken or lost, he had to rely on a small gladius against opponents, often better equipped for close combat. This built-in dramatic arc, from dangerous distance fighter to vulnerable close-quarters combatant, made hoplomachus fights particularly suspenseful. The provocator, or challenger, represented a special category. These gladiators fought only against others of their type, equipped identically with medium-sized rectangular shields, straight swords, and distinctive breastplates that offered more torso protection than most gladiatorial armor. Provocator fights were pure tests of skill, with no equipment advantages to influence the outcome. They were often used to open games, their evenly matched combat warming up the crowd for the asymmetric battles to follow. Perhaps the most exotic type was the Etruscans, who fought from war chariots in the Celtic tradition. These gladiators required not only combat skills, but also the ability to control horses while fighting, adding an element of unpredictability that Roman crowds loved. The Etruscan might begin fighting from his chariot, then dismount for ground combat, creating a multi-phase battle that could shift dramatically based on when and how the transition occurred. Each gladiatorial type required years to master. The specific muscle memory for a retiarius's net cast was entirely different from a murmillo's shield work. The footwork of a thraex bore no resemblance to a secuta's aggressive rushes. This specialization meant that gladiators developed profound expertise in their particular style, but also that they were vulnerable to unexpected situations. A murmillo trained to face the quick attacks of a thraex might struggle against the unusual angles of a retiarius's trident. The psychological profiles of different gladiator types became part of arena lore. Retiari were considered effeminate and cowardly by some Romans, fighting nearly naked and running from their opponents. Yet successful retiari were among the most celebrated fighters, their victories seen as triumphs of skill over strength. Myrmilones were viewed as the solid, dependable type, not flashy but reliable. Thraces had a reputation for viciousness, their curved swords associated with particularly bloody wounds. The Doctor's Paradox. Galen of Pergamon arrived at the gladiatorial school in his home city in 157 AD, a young physician eager to study anatomy, but bound by Roman law that prohibited the dissection of human corpses. What he found in the blood-soaked sand of the training grounds would revolutionize medicine for the next 1,000 years. Though the moral paradox of his position, healing men whose profession was killing, would haunt his philosophical writings for the rest of his life. The morning they brought in Titus, a veteran murmillo with a deep puncture wound in his lower abdomen, Galen faced the fundamental contradiction of his work. The wound was almost certainly fatal. The distinctive smell indicated perforated intestines. Standard practice would be to make the gladiator comfortable while he died, but Galen had been developing new surgical techniques, studying the anatomy of wounds that no other physician had such regular opportunity to observe. He made an incision to explore the damage, something most physicians would never dare attempt. Inside, he could see exactly what the thraex's curved blade had done, how it had slipped beneath the bottom edge of Titus's shield and found the gap in his armor. The intestine was indeed perforated in 2 places. Working with the speed that came from treating dozens of similar wounds, Galen cleaned the cavity with wine and vinegar, sutured the intestinal wall with silk thread so fine it was nearly invisible, and closed the external wound with a technique he had developed that minimized scarring. Titus survived. More remarkably, he returned to the arena 3 months later, the scar hidden beneath his wide leather belt. This was the paradox that defined Galen's 5 years as a gladiatorial physician. His greatest medical triumphs enabled future violence. Every gladiator he saved would likely cause another's death. Every innovative treatment he developed prolonged careers that ended, inevitably, in someone's blood on the sand. Yet the knowledge Galen gained was incomparable. He saw into living human bodies in ways previously impossible, understanding how muscles connected to bones, how organs related to each other, how the body responded to different types of trauma. He documented varieties of head injuries and their effects on consciousness and motor function. He observed how different weapons created characteristic wound patterns. He learned which injuries looked terrible but healed quickly, and which seemingly minor cuts proved fatal. The gladiators themselves presented unique medical challenges. Their diet and training had given them unusual physiology, layers of subcutaneous fat over highly developed muscle, cardiovascular conditioning that allowed them to maintain activity despite blood loss that would incapacitate ordinary people, and pain tolerance that bordered on superhuman. Galen noted that gladiators rarely complained during treatment, even for procedures that would have other patients screaming. Whether this was cultural conditioning or selection bias, those who couldn't endure pain didn't survive long enough to become his patients. Remained unclear. You enter the training ground, your wooden sword weighs twice what a real gladius would, and after an hour of drills, your arm burns from shoulder to fingertips. The afternoon sun beats down on the practice yard of the Ludus Magnus in Rome, the greatest gladiatorial school in the empire, connected to the Colosseum itself by an underground tunnel. You are 3 weeks into your training as a provocator, and you're beginning to understand that everything you thought you knew about fighting was wrong. The doctor, they're all called doctor, these trainers, as if teaching death were a form of medicine, circles you with the predatory patience of a man who has seen 1,000 recruits think themselves warriors. His name is Flaccus, a former provocateur himself, with 32 victories before earning his freedom. The scars covering his arms and torso are a testament to battles where victory came at a price. He has been deconstructing every instinct you possessed about combat, replacing them with movements that feel unnatural, but which, he assures you, will keep you alive. You stand before the palace, the thick wooden post that has become your primary opponent. Its surface is scarred from countless thousands of practice strikes, generations of gladiators learning their deadly craft against this unmoving enemy. Flaccus has marked specific targets on the post, a circle at throat height, another at heart level, marks for the major arteries in the thighs. These are the kill points, the places where a successful strike ends a fight immediately. Everything else, he has told you repeatedly, is theatre. The shield on your left arm, though lighter than the metal version you'll carry in the arena, still feels like lifting a door. Flaccus has made you hold it at the precise angle for an hour at a time, building the specific muscles needed to maintain defensive position even when exhausted. Your legs ache from the particular stance provocateurs must maintain. Weight forward but balanced, ready to advance or retreat instantly. Every part of your body is being reshaped for a specific purpose. Strike, Flaccus barks, and you drive your wooden sword at the heart-height target. The impact jars your entire arm, but you've learned to grip the handle in a way that prevents the shock from loosening your hold. Again, faster. The rhythm increases, thrust and recover, until your movements become mechanical, automatic. This is the goal, to make the complex simple, to train your muscles to act without thought's delay. Between strike sequences, Flaccus corrects minute details of your form, the angle of your wrist, the position of your elbow, the way your hip turns to add power to the thrust. Each correction seems insignificant, but you've watched veteran gladiators train and seen how these tiny differences compound into overwhelming advantage. A thumb's width of additional reach, a fraction of a second saved in recovery. These are the margins between victory and death. Other trainees work around you, each at different stages of development. The newest recruits, still soft from their previous lives, struggle with basic conditioning. They run endless laps around the courtyard, building the stamina that will keep them fighting when every muscle screams for rest. You remember those first days, when you vomited from exhaustion and wondered if death might be preferable to another circuit. Now you can maintain combat pace for 20 minutes without gasping, though Flaccus tells you a real fight might last an hour. The advanced students spar with wooden weapons, their matches supervised by multiple doctors who call out corrections and occasionally intervene when tempers flare. These practice fights are where theory meets application, where you learn that an opponent is nothing like a practice post. The man across from you has his own training, his own tricks, his own desperation to survive. You must learn to read the subtle shifts in stance that telegraph an attack, the way fatigue shows in drooping shield position, the psychological moment when an opponent's confidence breaks. Women in the arena, the gladiatrix, the existence of female gladiators, gladiatresses, represents one of the most fascinating contradictions in Roman society's complex relationship with gender, violence, and spectacle. While Roman women of the upper classes were expected to embody pudicitia, modesty, chastity, and domestic virtue, some women chose or were forced into the arena, where they fought with the same deadly skill as their male counterparts. Their presence in gladiatorial games scandalized conservative Romans, while simultaneously drawing enormous crowds eager to witness this ultimate transgression of gender norms. The historical evidence for gladiatrices is scattered but undeniable. A marble relief from Halicarnassus, now in the British Museum, depicts two female gladiators named Amazon and Achillea, shown in combat stance with proper gladiatorial equipment. The inscription notes that both were granted missio, honourable discharge, suggesting their fight was of such quality that both deserved to survive. Legal texts mention them repeatedly, usually in the context of attempts to ban or regulate their participation. Juvenal's sixth satire contains a lengthy passage mocking upper-class women who trained as gladiators, describing their panting efforts at the practice post and the incongruity of feminine beauty covered in armour. The motivations for women entering the arena varied as much as those of male gladiators. Some were slaves or condemned criminals with no choice in the matter. Others were lower-class free women, seeking prize money that far exceeded what they could earn in any respectable profession available to women. Most scandalous of all were the upper-class women who voluntarily entered gladiatorial training, apparently motivated by the same complex mixture of debt, desperation, and desire for glory that drove male auctorati. Emperor Nero particularly enjoyed female gladiatorial contests, organising games where women fought not only each other but also male dwarfs, creating spectacles that combined multiple forms of social transgression. He even had women of senatorial rank train as gladiators, though whether any actually fought in public games remains unclear. The idea of aristocratic women in the arena so horrified traditional Romans that subsequent emperors repeatedly banned the practice, though the frequency of these bans suggests they were widely ignored. The training of gladiatresses appears to have followed similar patterns to male gladiators. They lived in the same ludi, though presumably in separate quarters. They learned the same fighting styles, with archaeological evidence suggesting they most commonly fought as provocators or thraces. A passage in Petronius's Satyricon mentions female Essodari fighting from chariots, adding another layer of spectacle to their performances. The physical requirements were demanding. Gladiatresses needed the same strength, endurance, and skill as male fighters, plus the additional challenge of overcoming whatever physical disadvantages they might have in reach or raw power. The crowd's reaction to female gladiators was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, their presence in the arena represented a thrilling violation of social norms, a spectacle made more exciting by its transgressiveness. Roman writers describe audiences becoming particularly animated during female combats, suggesting these fights drew special attention. On the other hand, gladiatrices faced additional mockery and moral condemnation. They were seen as having abandoned not just social status, but their fundamental nature as women. Some gladiatresses achieved considerable fame. Graffiti from Pompeii mentions several by name, suggesting they had followings similar to male gladiators. A tomb inscription from Londinium mentions a gladiatrix named Claudia, who died at age 23 after 7 victories. The fact that she received a marked grave with a commemorative inscription indicates someone, perhaps fellow gladiators or admirers, cared enough to properly memorialize her despite her infamous profession. The equipment used by gladiatresses appears to have been largely identical to that of male gladiators, with one notable exception frequently mentioned in sources: they often fought with exposed breasts. This detail, confirmed by the Halicarnassus relief and mentioned in several literary sources, seems to have been a deliberate choice to emphasize their femininity while they engaged in the most masculine of activities. Whether this was the gladiatress's choice, a requirement from those staging the games, or a combination of both remains unknown. The sexual dimension of female gladiatorial combat cannot be ignored. Roman sexuality was complex and often contradictory, and the sight of women engaged in mortal combat clearly held erotic appeal for some spectators. Martial wrote epigrams about the sexual desirability of gladiatresses, and archaeological evidence includes oil lamps decorated with explicitly sexual scenes involving female gladiators. This sexualization added another layer to their already complex social position. They were simultaneously warriors and sexual objects, empowered and exploited, famous and infamous. Spartacus, when slaves became an army. In 73 BC, in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, approximately 200 gladiators made a decision that would shake Rome to its foundations. They would not simply escape. Escaped slaves were common enough to have established procedures for recapture. They would revolt, and in revolting, transform themselves from property into an existential threat to the Roman order itself. At their head stood a Thracian named Spartacus, whose name would echo through history as the archetype of slave rebellion. The exact circumstances that transformed Spartacus from one of many enslaved gladiators into the leader of the ancient world's greatest slave revolt remain partially shrouded in historical uncertainty. Plutarch tells us he was a Thracian of nomadic stock, possessed of great physical strength, but also unexpected intelligence and culture. His wife, a prophetess of the same tribe, was enslaved with him and claimed to have visions of his future greatness. Appian adds that he had served as an auxiliary in the Roman army before some unspecified crime led to his enslavement, which would explain his knowledge of Roman military tactics that proved so devastating in the coming war. The initial escape was almost comedic in its improvisation. The gladiators' plot was betrayed, forcing them to act before they were ready. Only 78 managed to escape, seizing kitchen knives and spits from the school's cookhouse, since they couldn't reach the armory. On the road outside Capua, they had the good fortune to encounter wagons carrying gladiatorial weapons to another school. Thus armed, they defeated the small garrison sent to recapture them and established a defensive position on Mount Vesuvius. What happened next transformed a local slave escape into a massive rebellion. Slaves from the agricultural estates surrounding Vesuvius began fleeing to join the gladiators. These were not gladiators. They were field hands, domestic servants, shepherds, and labourers who saw in Spartacus's band something they had never imagined possible: successful defiance of Rome. Within weeks, the 78 had become 700. Within months, thousands. At its peak, ancient sources claim Spartacus commanded between 70,000 and 120,000 followers, though these numbers are likely exaggerated. The composition of this slave army reveals much about the nature of Roman slavery and the appeal of Spartacus's rebellion. They came from across the Mediterranean world: Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Syrians, Africans, united only by their enslavement and their desperation. Many had been free warriors, captured in Rome's endless wars of expansion. Others were born into slavery, knowing no life beyond the whip and chain. Some were educated Greeks, serving as tutors and administrators. This diversity, which should have been a weakness, became a strength under Spartacus's leadership. He organized them by nationality and skill set, creating specialized units that could adapt to different tactical situations. The military success of the slave army stemmed partly from gladiatorial training, but more from Spartacus's strategic brilliance. He understood that his forces could never match Roman legions in formal battle, so he developed tactics that exploited his army's advantages. Knowledge of local terrain, motivated fighters, and the element of surprise. His forces used the mountainous terrain of southern Italy to ambush Roman columns, disappearing into hills and forests when faced with superior numbers. They practiced what would later be called guerrilla warfare, though the Romans had no concept or counter-strategy for such tactics. The psychological impact of Spartacus's rebellion exceeded even its military significance. The idea that slaves could not merely escape, but actively defeat Roman forces, struck at the heart of Roman self-conception. Rome was built on slavery. By this period, perhaps 30% of Italy's population was enslaved. The economy depended entirely on slave labor. If slaves could successfully revolt, if they could defeat Roman legions and roam freely through Italy, then the entire structure of Roman society was at risk. Rome's initial response revealed dangerous complacency. The Senate sent militia forces under praetors, treating the rebellion as a police action rather than a war. Spartacus destroyed these forces completely. The gladiator Crixus, leading a splinter force of 30,000, defeated a consular army before being killed in a separate engagement. Only when Spartacus defeated both consuls, commanding full legions, did Rome finally acknowledge the severity of the crisis. The appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus to command 8 legions against Spartacus marked the rebellion's turning point. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, saw the campaign as an opportunity for military glory to match his economic power. He restored discipline to demoralized Roman forces through decimation, executing every 10th man in units that had fled from battle. He then systematically cornered Spartacus in southern Italy, building a wall across the entire peninsula to trap the slave army. The end came at the Battle of the Salarius River in 71 BC. Spartacus, knowing defeat was inevitable, reportedly killed his own horse before the battle, declaring he would either win many better horses from the Romans or have no need of one. He died trying to cut his way through to Crassus personally, falling wounded but fighting on his knees until the end. His body was never identified among the thousands of slave corpses littering the battlefield. Evening prayers in the cells. As darkness falls across the ludus, the cacophony of combat training gives way to more intimate sounds, whispered conversations, the clink of chains being arranged for sleep, and from various corners of the barracks, the soft murmur of prayers to gods both familiar and foreign. In these twilight moments before exhaustion claims consciousness, gladiators reach out to whatever divine powers might listen to the pleas of the condemned. In one cell, Marcus the Mamillo kneels before a small clay figurine of Mars, the Roman war god whose favour he seeks not for victory. He learned long ago that Mars cares nothing for individual survival, but for courage to die well if tomorrow brings his end. His prayers are formulaic, learned in childhood before slavery claimed him, but tonight they carry the weight of premonition. He has survived 18 fights, a respectable number that grows heavier with each victory. The odds, he knows, are cumulative. Each survival makes the next less likely. 2 cells away, a Thracian gladiator named Drakon performs rituals to Sabazios, the horseman god of his homeland. He pours a few drops of wine onto the stone floor. Wine saved from dinner, a sacrifice that costs him one of his few pleasures. His prayers are in his native tongue, incomprehensible to Roman ears, but carrying the ache of exile. He prays not for himself, but for his family, sold separately at the slave market 3 years ago. Are they alive? Do his children remember their father's face? Sabazios offers no answers, only the cold comfort of familiar ritual. The Retiarius Secundus worships Neptune, finding theological comfort in serving the god of the sea, while fighting with net and trident. His devotion is newer, adopted since entering the ludus, but no less sincere. He has convinced himself that his fighting style makes him Neptune's earthly avatar, that each victory honors the god of waters. This narrative gives meaning to meaningless violence, transforms base survival into divine service. A Germanic prisoner of war maintains his devotion to Wodan, though he must practice in secret. Foreign gods are tolerated in the ludus, but Germanic deities carry the taint of recent rebellion. He touches the small wooden amulet hidden in his straw mattress, carved with runes that Roman eyes would interpret as decoration. His prayers are wordless, more feeling than language, a desperate reach across impossible distance to forests he will never see again. The Feast of the Condemned. The Cena Libera, the free feast, held the night before major games, represented one of the arena's strangest rituals, a public banquet where gladiators, who might die tomorrow, ate while citizens of Rome watched them like animals in a menagerie. It was simultaneously a generous gesture and a cruel spectacle, providing condemned men with earthly pleasures while reminding viewers of their subhuman status. The feast took place in a public space near the arena, often in the spoliarium where corpses would be processed after tomorrow's games. Long tables were arranged with surprising attention to hierarchy. Veteran gladiators, volunteers, and those fighting in the Primus Palace. The main event received better positions and superior food. Novices and condemned criminals occupied the periphery, their last meal reflecting their minimal value. The menu varied based on the sponsor's generosity and the game's importance. For major imperial games, gladiators might feast on roasted meats, fresh fruits imported from across the empire, honeyed wines, and delicacies most would never have tasted in freedom. Provincial games offered simpler fare, but still superior to the barley gruel that constituted their usual diet. Some gladiators gorged themselves, reasoning that tomorrow's death made moderation pointless. Others ate sparingly, knowing that fighting on an overfull stomach invited disaster. Around the dining gladiators, Roman citizens pressed close, separated by wooden barriers or rope lines, but near enough to observe every detail. Some came to evaluate fighters for betting purposes, examining musculature and temperament, like horse traders at market. Others sought vicarious thrills, imagining themselves possessing such dangerous power. Women sometimes attended, defying social convention, to gaze at bodies that would tomorrow provide violent entertainment. The gladiators' responses to this attention varied dramatically. Some performed for the crowd, boasting of past victories and promising spectacular deaths for their opponents. These performances were partly genuine bravado, partly calculated attempts to win crowd favour that might save them if defeated. Other gladiators maintained stony silence, eating mechanically while ignoring the spectators entirely. A few openly wept, overcome by terror that discipline could no longer suppress. Veterans often took responsibility for calming younger fighters, sharing hard-won wisdom about managing fear and maintaining dignity. They spoke of the crowd's fickleness, how courage in defeat could earn mercy, while cowardice guaranteed death. They described the strange clarity that descended during combat, when training overcame terror and the body moved without conscious thought. These conversations, conducted within earshot of eager spectators, added another layer to the evening's entertainment. Bread and circuses, the political arena. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, coined by the satirist Juvenal, has echoed through centuries as shorthand for political appeasement through base entertainment. But this cynical reduction fails to capture the sophisticated political technology that gladiatorial games represented. They were not mere distractions but complex instruments of governance, simultaneously demonstrating state power, redistributing wealth, reinforcing social hierarchy, and creating shared cultural experience across an impossibly diverse empire. The political economy of gladiatorial games began with their staggering cost. A modest provincial game might cost 20,000 sesterces, more than a successful merchant's lifetime earnings. Major imperial games could consume millions, equivalent to the annual tax revenue of entire provinces. These sums covered gladiator rentals, animal procurement, venue preparation, equipment, support staff, and the elaborate stage machinery that Romans increasingly expected. No individual could afford such expenditure without substantial wealth, immediately limiting who could sponsor games, and thus who could access their political benefits. Yet the return on investment could be extraordinary. Julius Caesar understood this when he promised games featuring 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor, a spectacle so lavish it prompted Senate legislation limiting gladiatorial displays. The games were his bid for popular support in his rivalry with Pompey, an investment in political capital that would pay dividends during his rise to power. His calculation was precise. The cost of the games was less than what military conquest would yield, but the games were necessary to maintain popular support for those conquests. Augustus transformed gladiatorial games from aristocratic competition into imperial monopoly. He restricted who could present games, how often they could be held, and how many gladiators could participate. In Rome itself, only the emperor and his designated representatives could sponsor major games. This centralization transformed gladiatorial combat from a tool of competitive political advancement into an instrument of imperial authority. The arena became a space where the emperor's power was performed, demonstrated, and renewed through ritualized violence. The seating arrangement in amphitheaters materialized social hierarchy in stone and space. The emperor's box, the pulvinar, occupied the optimal viewing position, elevated enough to see clearly, but close enough to demonstrate courage in proximity to danger. Senators sat in marble seats at arena level, their names carved into their designated spaces. Behind them, equestrians occupied the next 14 rows. Then came ordinary citizens, subdivided by tribe and social distinction. Women, except for the Vestal virgins, were relegated to the highest tiers. Slaves and non-citizens, if admitted at all, stood in wooden galleries at the very top. This arrangement served multiple political functions. It reminded everyone of their place in the Roman hierarchy, while simultaneously creating a shared experience that transcended those divisions. The senator and the shopkeeper might sit in different sections, but they gasped at the same reversals, cheered the same victories. The amphitheatre created what Benedict Anderson would later call an imagined community, a sense of collective identity among people who would never meet but who shared the experience of witnessing imperial spectacle. The games also functioned as a peculiar form of democracy within autocracy. The crowd's reactions influenced imperial policy, expressed approval or displeasure with emperors, and occasionally saved or condemned public figures. When Nero performed in the arena, the crowd's reluctant applause communicated more effectively than any Senate debate could have. When Commodus fought as a gladiator, charging the treasury 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance, public ridicule undermined his authority more than any conspiracy. The political messaging of games extended beyond simple popularity contests. The specific types of spectacles communicated imperial priorities and values. Naval battles, naumachii, demonstrated Rome's mastery over nature itself, flooding arenas to recreate historical sea battles. Beast hunts, venationes, showcased the empire's global reach through exotic animals from Africa, Asia, and Germania. Executions, disguised as mythological reenactments, noxi, transformed criminal justice into moral instruction. Each element reinforced narratives of Roman superiority, divine favour, and the natural order of imperial rule. The day Commodus entered the arena, on the morning of November 20th, 192 AD, the Emperor Commodus descended from his palace to the underground passages of the Colosseum, but not to observe the games from the imperial box. He came dressed as a secutor, carrying real weapons, intending to fight as a gladiator before 50,000 subjects who were required to pretend their divine emperor was just another arena entertainer. This grotesque performance would be repeated on hundreds of occasions, each one further eroding the dignity of both imperial office and gladiatorial profession. Commodus had been obsessed with gladiatorial combat since childhood, training secretly in the palace with imported fighters who understood that defeating the prince meant death, regardless of the bout's outcome. When he became emperor at 18, his obsession transformed from private vice to public scandal. He built a private arena in the palace where he fought daily, but this wasn't enough. He craved the genuine crowd, the real sand, the authentic terror in his opponent's eyes, or at least a convincing simulation of it. The other gladiators knew before entering that they would lose. Not losing meant death by torture, their families sold into slavery or worse, so they performed an elaborate dance of feigned combat, making Commodus look skilled while ensuring he emerged victorious. He particularly enjoyed fighting as a secutor against retiarii, claiming he was pursuing the enemies of Rome. The symbolism was lost on no one. The nearly naked, lightly armed net fighters representing Rome's enemies, while the heavily armoured emperor represented Roman might. The crowd was forced to chant his gladiatorial name, Amazonia, and celebrate his victories with the enthusiasm typically reserved for genuine champions. Heralds announced his record, 735 victories, each one as hollow as the emperor's claims to divinity. He charged the treasury 1,000,000 sesterces for each appearance, claiming he deserved payment like any professional gladiator. The Senate was forced to formally thank him for his services to Rome's entertainment. The damage Commodus inflicted extended beyond mere embarrassment. He corrupted the fundamental exchange between emperor and people that the games represented. Instead of the emperor providing entertainment for the masses were forced to provide validation for the emperor's fantasies. Instead of demonstrating imperial courage through proximity to danger, Commodus revealed imperial cowardice through orchestrated victories. He transformed the arena from a space of genuine, if brutal, competition into a theatre of imperial delusion. His gladiatorial obsession eventually contributed to his assassination. On New Year's Eve, 192 AD, conspirators strangled him in his bath, ending a reign that had reduced Rome's highest office to arena performer. The Senate immediately began destroying his statues and inscriptions, trying to erase the memory of an emperor who had so thoroughly debased the purple. Yet the damage was lasting. Commodus had revealed the performative nature of imperial power, showing that the difference between emperor and gladiator was perhaps smaller than Romans wanted to believe. You sit in the cavea, you have arrived at the Colosseum before dawn to secure a decent spot in the plebeian section, carrying the small cushion that will make 8 hours on stone benches bearable, and the leather water skin that might last until the midday break. Around you, 50,000 others engage in the same preparations, creating a human river flowing through the 76 public entrances, each marked with numbers corresponding to tokens distributed across the city. Your token directs you to the third tier, the second mainianum, where ordinary citizens without special distinction sit. Below you, closer to the action, you can see the bright white togas of senators already filling their designated marble seats, each one carved with its occupant's name. Permanent reservations in stone. Above you, women's voices carry from the highest tier, their excitement pitched higher than the masculine rumble that dominates the lower sections. The social geography of Rome is mapped in 3 dimensions around you. The morning light reveals the arena's fresh sand, brilliant white from the beaches of the Tiber, mixed with darker volcanic sand from Vesuvius. You know that by noon it will be churned brown with blood and dirt, but for now it gleams like fresh snow. Beneath that pristine surface, you're aware of the hypogeum's existence, the underground maze where gladiators, animals, and stage machinery wait. Sometimes you hear roars from below, beasts driven to fury by starvation and goads, their rage building toward the moment of release. The crowd's energy is palpable, a living thing that ebbs and flows with its own tidal logic. Vendors work the aisles selling wine, dates, almonds, and small bread rolls stamped with the editor's seal. Even food becomes advertisement here. Prostitutes advertise their services for after the games, their prices varying by section. Gamblers call out odds on the morning's first match, their calculations based on gladiators' records, equipment matchups, and insider information about injuries or training. A trumpet blast silences the crowd momentarily as the pompa, the opening procession, begins. The editor of the games enters first, wearing a purple-bordered toga that marks his magistracy, followed by lictors carrying the fasces that symbolize Roman authority. Behind them come the gladiators, not yet armed but wearing their distinctive armor, each type immediately recognizable. The crowd erupts in partisan cheering, some calling out individual names, others shouting for their preferred fighting styles. The morning's program begins with bloodless displays, mock fights with wooden weapons, elaborate choreographed battles that showcase technique without risk. These preliminaries serve as appetizers, whetting the crowd's appetite while allowing latecomers to find their seats. You appreciate the skill displayed, but like everyone around you, you're waiting for the real entertainment to begin. When the first actual combat is announced, a classic matchup between Mamilo and Thraex, the atmosphere transforms. The collective intake of breath from 50,000 throats creates a sound like wind through trees. You lean forward with everyone else, your heart rate accelerating, though you're merely watching. This is the drug of the arena, the vicarious experience of mortal danger from positions of absolute safety. Naval battles in the desert. The naumachia, the flooding of the Colosseum for naval battles, represented Rome's most audacious statement about its mastery over nature and nations. To transform an amphitheatre in the heart of a landlocked city into an artificial sea, to stage historical naval battles with condemned prisoners fighting on actual ships. This was imperial power made tangible through engineering that bordered on the miraculous. The first recorded naumachia was staged by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, who excavated an enormous basin in the Campus Martius, filling it with water diverted from the Tiber. The battle recreated the conflict between Egyptian and Tyrian fleets, with 2,000 condemned prisoners and 4,000 rowers fighting to actual death. The spectacle was so expensive and logistically complex that Caesar's opponents cited it as evidence of his dangerous extravagance. Yet, the political returns were undeniable. The Roman people talked of nothing else for months. Augustus expanded the concept, creating a permanent naumachia basin beside the Tiber, measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet. For the dedication of this venue in 2 BC, he staged a recreation of the Battle of Salamis, the famous Greek victory over Persia. 3,000 men fought in 30 full-sized warships, not counting the rowers. The choice of battle was politically calculated. By recreating Greek victory over Eastern despotism, Augustus aligned himself with civilized West against barbarous East, a narrative that justified his own civil war victories. The Colosseum's transformation for naval battles required engineering that still challenges modern understanding. The arena floor was waterproofed and flooded to a depth of 5 feet, enough to float specially designed shallow draft vessels, but not so deep as to stress the substructure. The water came from a dedicated aqueduct branch, with drainage systems that could empty the entire arena in hours. Ships were constructed in sections, assembled in the flooded arena, and had to be light enough for condemned prisoners to row, but sturdy enough to withstand ramming. The human cost of naumachii was staggering. Unlike gladiatorial combat, where skilled fighters had survival value, naval battle participants were expendable. They were typically prisoners of war or condemned criminals with death sentences. Given the choice between execution and the slim possibility of survival through victory, most couldn't swim. An irrelevant skill since armor and chains made swimming impossible anyway. Death came from drowning as often as from combat. The spectacle of naumachii went beyond mere combat. These were theatrical productions with plots, costumes, and dramatic arcs. Claudius staged a battle between Rhodes and Sicily on the Fucine Lake, involving 19,000 fighters. Before combat began, the condemned sailors saluted the emperor with what became history's most famous gladiatorial phrase, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. Claudius responded, perhaps jokingly, or not, which the fighters interpreted as reprieve. They refused to fight until threatened with massacre by surrounding troops. Priscus and Verus, the draw that shook Rome. During the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 AD, under the Emperor Titus, two gladiators named Priscus and Verus fought a match that would become legendary, not for its violence, but for its remarkable conclusion. A simultaneous victory that challenged the very structure of gladiatorial combat. Both men were slaves fighting for their freedom, each victory bringing them closer to the wooden sword, the rudis, that symbolized honorable discharge from arena service. The matchup was classic. Priscus fought as a thraex with curved sword and small shield, Verus as a mirmillo with straight blade and large scutum. They had likely trained in the same ludus, knew each other's techniques, perhaps even considered themselves brothers in the gladiatorial familia. The fight lasted over an hour, an extraordinary duration that spoke to both men's skill and conditioning. Witnesses described it as less a battle than a deadly dance, each fighter anticipating and countering the other's moves with precision born from years of training. When Priscus gained advantage, Verus would recover through technique or determination. When Verus seemed ready to deliver the killing blow, Priscus would twist away at the last instant, his curved blade finding unexpected angles of counterattack. As the fight progressed, something remarkable happened in the stands. The usual partisan cheering, some supporting Priscus, others, Verus, gradually unified into appreciation for both warriors. The crowd began cheering every exchange, gasping at near misses, applauding defensive sequences as enthusiastically as attacks. They were witnessing not mere combat but artistry, two masters of their craft pushing each other to heights neither could achieve alone. When both men finally lowered their weapons simultaneously, exhausted beyond the ability to continue, they created an unprecedented situation. There was no victor, no defeated party to appeal for mercy. The crowd's response was equally unprecedented. They demanded that both be granted not just missio, survival, but the rudis, immediate freedom. Titus, reading the crowd's mood with the political acuity that effective emperors required, awarded both men their freedom on the spot. They walked from the arena side by side, no longer slaves but liberty, free men who had earned their liberty through mutual recognition of each other's worth. The Colosseum, architecture of empire, the Flavian amphitheatre, known to history as the Colosseum, stands as the ultimate architectural expression of Rome's relationship with violence as spectacle. Completed in 80 AD under Titus, it was not merely the largest amphitheatre in the world, but a machine designed to process death into entertainment with maximum efficiency and theatrical impact. Every stone, every passage, every sightline was calculated to serve the dual purposes of spectacular display and crowd control. The statistics alone convey its monumental scale: 540 meters in circumference, 188 meters at its widest point, 48 meters high, dimensions that allowed it to hold between 50 and 80,000 spectators, depending on configuration. But raw size tells only part of the story. The true genius lay in how this massive structure organized human movement and experience, creating what was essentially a vertical city dedicated to watching death. The exterior presented 4 stories of arched openings, 80 arches per floor, creating a rhythmic facade that seemed to breathe with the crowds flowing in and out. Each arch on the ground level was numbered, corresponding to tokens distributed throughout the city. This system could empty the entire building in less than 10 minutes, a crucial safety feature when managing crowds larger than most ancient cities. The architecture itself enforced social hierarchy, separate entrances for different classes, corridors that never intersected, ensuring that senator and slave might attend the same games without ever sharing the same space. Inside, the cavea rose in 4 distinct tiers, each angled at precisely calculated degrees to ensure unobstructed views. Roman engineers had mastered the science of sightlines, understanding how the human eye tracked rapid movement and what angles best displayed combat. The lowest tier, the podium, placed senators close enough to see facial expressions, but high enough to avoid blood spray, though not always successfully, as Cicero complained about being splattered during a particularly enthusiastic decapitation. But the Colosseum's true marvel was hidden beneath the arena floor. The hypogeum, a 2-level subterranean complex that was the backstage of death. Here, in a maze of corridors, chambers, and mechanical rooms, gladiators waited in cells that connected directly to the arena above through 32 trapdoors. Elaborate pulley systems operated by hundreds of slaves could lift fighters, animals, or scenery into the arena at precisely choreographed moments. A wounded gladiator could disappear through one trapdoor while his replacement emerged from another, creating an illusion of endless combat. The animal handling systems were equally sophisticated. Cages on wheeled platforms could be moved through corridors wide enough for elephants. Ramps led to arena level, where handlers used fire and noise to drive beasts into the killing ground at exactly the right moment. The walls of these passages still bear the claw marks of desperate animals, a visceral record of terror preserved in stone. Water systems throughout the structure served multiple functions. Fountains on each level provided drinking water for spectators. Staying hydrated during all-day games in Roman summer was essential. Drainage systems could handle both rain and the enormous amounts of blood that needed regular flushing. For naumachii, the entire arena could be waterproofed with wooden planking and sealed canvas, then flooded through dedicated pipes connected to the Aqua Claudia aqueduct. The velarium, a retractable awning system operated by sailors from the imperial fleet, could cover 2/3 of the seating area, providing shade that made summer games bearable. The engineering required to support and operate this massive canvas structure, imagine covering a modern football stadium with cloth, required permanent anchor points in the building's upper structure, and a complex system of ropes and pulleys that took 100 men to operate. Acoustic design received equal attention. The Colosseum's elliptical shape and careful proportioning meant that sound from the arena floor carried clearly to the highest seats. The emperor's announcements, gladiators' death cries, and the roar of beasts were all audible throughout the structure. This acoustic clarity was essential for maintaining crowd engagement. Spectators needed to hear, as well as see the violence unfolding below. Sunset through stone arches. As the afternoon games wind toward evening, golden light slants through the Colosseum's western arches, transforming the arena into something almost beautiful. The sand, churned and bloodied through hours of combat, catches the light in ways that make it gleam like crushed rubies. The marble statues of gods and heroes that crown the building's uppermost tier are silhouetted against a sky shifting from blue to amber to rose. The crowd has thinned somewhat. Many left after the main event, the Primus Palace that featured the most skilled gladiators. Those who remain are the true connoisseurs of arena violence, willing to sit through the lesser matches and criminal executions that fill the program's final hours. Their conversations are quieter now, technical discussions of fighting techniques observed, bets settled, performances evaluated with the critical eye of expertise. In this liminal moment between day and night, the arena reveals its dual nature most clearly. It is simultaneously sacred and profane, a temple where death is worshipped, and a slaughterhouse where human cattle are processed. The dying light softens the harsh edges of recent violence. Pools of blood become abstract patterns. Discarded weapons glint like scattered jewelry. The gouges in the sand from desperate struggles look almost like deliberate art. The cleaning crews are already at work in sections where combat has concluded, raking the sand smooth, sprinkling fresh white sand over the worst stains, gathering abandoned equipment for sorting and repair. They work with practiced efficiency, preparing the stage for tomorrow's performances. One imagines they must become inured to the human remains they occasionally encounter. Fingers severed by sword strikes, teeth knocked free, occasionally larger parts that speak to particularly brutal ends. Through the arches, Rome itself is visible. The temples on the Palatine Hill, the insulae where poor citizens live stacked upon each other, the smoke from thousands of evening cooking fires, creating a haze that turns the sunset spectacular. The city and its great killing ground exist in symbiosis, each defining the other. Rome without the arena would be just another Mediterranean city. The arena without Rome would be merely a place of execution, rather than a theatre of empire. The editor's power, life, death, and thumbs. The moment of decision, when a defeated gladiator's fate hung in balance, represented the arena's most dramatic convergence of individual mercy and collective will. Popular culture has simplified this to thumbs up or thumbs down, but the historical reality was far more complex, involving elaborate gestures, political calculations, and the delicate negotiation between editor, crowd, and the imperative of maintaining spectacle without excessive waste of expensive human resources. When a gladiator could no longer continue fighting, wounded, exhausted, or simply overwhelmed, he could appeal for missio, reprieve, and menestar. The gesture was specific, dropping his shield, raising his left hand with one finger extended, a formal acknowledgement of defeat, combined with a request for mercy. This moment transformed him from combatant to supplicant, his life depending not on his sword, but on his earlier performance and the crowd's mood. The crowd's role was advisory, not determinative. They expressed their preference through various gestures. The sources mentioned turned thumbs, pressed thumbs, handkerchiefs waved or hidden, but the exact meanings of these signals remain historically unclear. What is certain is that the crowd's preference was usually, but not always, honoured. The editor, whether emperor, magistrate, or private sponsor, held ultimate authority. He had to balance multiple considerations: the crowd's satisfaction, the financial cost of compensation for dead gladiators, the message sent by mercy or severity, and sometimes personal relationships with the gladiators' owners. The criteria for granting missio reveal Roman values in their starkest form. Courage mattered more than skill. A gladiator who fought bravely but lost might survive, while one who showed cowardice, despite technical proficiency, would die. The way a gladiator faced potential death was itself a performance. He was expected to remain still, offering his throat or heart for a clean killing blow, demonstrating that Roman courage extended even to the moment of extinction. Those who begged, cried, or tried to crawl away were invariably condemned. Economic factors significantly influenced these decisions. A trained gladiator represented substantial investment: purchase price, training costs, maintenance, medical care. Killing one required the editor to compensate the owner at rates up to 50 times the rental fee. For a successful gladiator worth 20,000 sesterces, this meant massive financial loss. Editors who too freely granted death might find themselves bankrupted by compensation costs, while those too merciful might face crowd riots. The actual execution, when ordered, followed specific protocols. The victorious gladiator would deliver the death blow cleanly, usually a thrust to the throat or heart, depending on the defeated fighter's position. Amateur hesitation or botched execution reflected poorly on victor and venue alike. After apparent death, an arena attendant dressed as Sparta, god of the underworld, would strike the corpse's head with a hammer, ensuring death while maintaining the pretense of divine involvement. Another attendant dressed as Mercury would then guide the soul to the afterlife, dragging the corpse through the portal of death. Yet even in death, gradations existed. Gladiators who died well, courageously, professionally, with dignity, received honourable treatment. Their bodies were returned to their familiae for proper burial, their names recorded with respect. Those who died badly, cowardly, desperately, shamefully, were dragged out with hooks and disposed of without ceremony. The distinction mattered enormously to gladiators, who knew that their final moments might define their entire legacy. The psychology of the mercy decision reveals troubling insights into human nature. Crowds were more likely to grant mercy early in the day, when bloodlust was not yet fully aroused. They were more merciful to attractive gladiators, to those with compelling personal stories, to fighters who reminded them of Roman virtues. They were crueler to foreigners, to those who fought in styles considered effeminate or cowardly, to criminals regardless of their arena performance. The decision often had little to do with the immediate fight and everything to do with broader prejudices and momentary emotions. Christian blood in pagan sand, the collision between Christianity and gladiatorial games represented more than a clash of entertainment preferences. It was the fundamental confrontation between two incompatible worldviews about the nature of human dignity, the meaning of death, and the proper relationship between the sacred and the spectacular. As Christianity spread through the empire during the first 3 centuries AD, its adherents found themselves caught in the arena's machinery, not as spectators, but as unwilling participants. Their executions transformed into elaborate, theatrical productions that inadvertently strengthened the very faith Rome sought to extinguish. The Roman perception of Christians as enemies of the state stemmed from multiple sources of anxiety. Their refusal to participate in imperial cult, to burn incense before the emperor's image, or swear by his genius, appeared as treasonous rejection of Roman authority. Their secret meetings, misunderstood communion rituals, and talk of eating flesh and drinking blood generated rumours of cannibalism and sexual depravity. Their apocalyptic theology, anticipating Rome's destruction in divine judgment, marked them as subversives hoping for imperial collapse. Most threatening of all, they rejected the fundamental premise of Roman society, that power, properly displayed through violence, revealed divine favour. When Christians were condemned to the arena, authorities often staged elaborate mythological reenactments, transforming executions into educational entertainment. A Christian might be dressed as Icarus, fitted with wax wings, and thrown from great height to teach the danger of hubris. Others played Orpheus, torn apart by bears while attempting to charm them with song. Women were cast as Dirce, tied to bulls and dragged to death. These theatrical executions served dual purposes. They entertained the crowd with familiar stories while demonstrating the fate of those who challenged Roman order. Yet something unexpected happened when Christians entered the arena. They refused to play their assigned roles in Rome's theatrical display of power. Instead of begging for mercy, they sang hymns. Instead of cursing their fate, they prayed for their persecutors. Instead of fighting back, which would have at least provided entertainment, they went to their deaths with a serenity that unnerved spectators accustomed to desperation. Their behavior violated the fundamental exchange of the arena. They would not provide the spectacle of fear that validated the crowd's safety. The account of Perpetua and Felicitas, executed in Carthage in 203 AD, illustrates this Christian subversion of arena conventions. Perpetua, a young noblewoman, and Felicitas, a slave, were condemned for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor. The editor planned to dress them as priestesses of Ceres, but Perpetua argued successfully that forcing them to wear pagan religious garments violated even Roman justice. When a cow, chosen to mock their gender, failed to kill them efficiently, the crowd, moved by their dignity, demanded they be granted quick deaths by sword. The Christian martyrs' writings reveal a remarkable psychological transformation of the arena experience. They described visions of the amphitheatre transformed into paradise, wild beasts becoming lambs, death becoming birth into eternal life. Ignatius of Antioch wrote, while being transported to Rome for arena execution, "I am God's wheat, ground fine by the lion's teeth, to be made pure bread for Christ." This rhetorical reversal transformed execution from punishment into sacrament, defeat into victory, entertainment into worship. The unintended consequence of Christian arena executions was the creation of a powerful counter-narrative to Roman ideology. Every martyr who died courageously challenged the premise that the gods favoured Rome. Every miracle story, lions refusing to attack, fires failing to burn, wounds healing spontaneously, suggested divine protection even in death. The arena, designed to demonstrate Roman power, became a stage for demonstrating the power of faith to transcend physical suffering. The crowd's reaction to Christian executions grew increasingly complex. As the religion spread, by the 3rd century, many spectators had Christian friends, neighbours, or family members. Watching their co-religionists die for beliefs they secretly shared created cognitive dissonance that undermined the game's entertainment value. Some pagans, impressed by Christian courage, converted after witnessing martyrdoms. Tertullian observed that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Each execution created more Christians than it eliminated. The philosophers discussed Seneca at the games, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Stoic philosopher and advisor to Nero, attended the games during the midday intermission, expecting to find lighter entertainment between the morning's beast hunts and afternoon's gladiatorial combats. What he witnessed instead was the naked face of human cruelty, stripped of even the pretense of sport, an experience that prompted one of antiquity's most powerful condemnations of arena violence. The noon executions lacked the ceremony and structure of gladiatorial combat. Condemned criminals were pushed into the arena with swords, but no armour, no training, no hope. The only rule was that everyone must die. The survivor of each pair faced a fresh executioner until none remained. There was no courage to admire, no skill to appreciate, no tension about the outcome. It was, Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, pure murder, and the crowd loved it more than the professional fights. In the morning, men are thrown to the lions and bears, Seneca observed. At noon, they are thrown to the spectators themselves. The crowd became the true beast, baying for blood, with an honesty that the gladiatorial combats concealed beneath ritual and rules. They shouted specific instructions for killing: strike, burn. Why does he die so timidly? Why does he kill with so little enthusiasm? The whip will make them fight. What disturbed Seneca most was not the violence itself. As a Roman aristocrat, he accepted that criminals deserved death, but the spiritual corruption of the spectators. He watched them lean forward during the killings, their faces transformed by bloodlust, then lean back during intermissions with bored indifference. They complained if the killing paused, if a criminal died too quickly, if there wasn't enough variety in the deaths. They had become connoisseurs of murder, their humanity eroded by regular exposure to staged atrocity. The philosopher recognized his own contamination. I come home, more greedy, more cruel and inhuman, because I have been among human beings. The games revealed an uncomfortable truth about socialization, that watching violence, even disapprovingly, creates accommodation to violence. Each visit to the arena moved the boundaries of acceptable brutality, normalized what should remain shocking, transformed citizens into accomplices in collective sadism. Constantine's compromise. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD with the Edict of Milan, the fundamental incompatibility between Christian theology and gladiatorial games created an immediate political crisis. The new faith, now protected and increasingly favored by imperial power, condemned the games as human sacrifice, murder as entertainment, and a fundamental violation of humanity's creation in God's image. Yet these same games remained enormously popular among the predominantly pagan population, providing employment for thousands and serving essential political functions that no emperor, even a Christian one, could simply abolish without risking revolt. Constantine's approach to this dilemma revealed the pragmatic political calculus that characterized his entire relationship with Christianity. In 325 AD, he issued a decree condemning gladiatorial games, in principle, while stopping far short of abolishing them. The language was carefully crafted. In times of peace and domestic tranquility, bloody spectacles displease us. The qualification was crucial. The games were inappropriate for peacetime, suggesting they might still serve purposes during conflict or crisis. The emperor's actual policies reflected even greater compromise. He banned the sentencing of criminals to gladiatorial schools, removing one source of arena fighters, but didn't prohibit voluntary enrollment or the use of prisoners of war. He ended the practice of forcing Christians specifically to become gladiators, but continued allowing pagan criminals the privilege of arena combat over immediate execution. He restricted games in certain eastern cities where Christianity was strong, but allowed them to continue in Rome and the western provinces where paganism dominated. The economic realities constraining Constantine were formidable. The gladiatorial industry employed directly or indirectly perhaps 1% of the empire's population. Trainers, doctors, armorsmiths, venue staff, animal handlers, merchants who supplied equipment, builders who maintained amphitheatres. Sudden abolition would have created massive unemployment and economic disruption. Moreover, many amphitheatres were municipal properties whose rental income funded public works. Ending the games meant finding alternative revenue sources that didn't exist. Political considerations were equally compelling. The Roman populace expected games as their right, part of the implicit contract between rulers and ruled. Previous emperors who had restricted games faced riots. Constantine, whose power base remained fragile, could not afford to alienate Rome's urban masses. The Senate, still predominantly pagan, would interpret abolition as an attack on traditional Roman values. Provincial elites, who sponsored games to demonstrate loyalty and gain popularity, would lose a crucial tool of local politics. The theological justifications for compromise were complex. Some Christian advisors argued that gladiatorial games, by demonstrating the consequences of sin and criminality, served moral purposes. Others suggested that voluntary gladiators exercised free will, making their choices morally legitimate, if regrettable. The comparison to military service, which Christianity didn't condemn despite its violence, provided another avenue for rationalization. The result was a gradual transformation, rather than abolition. Christian emperors increasingly replaced gladiatorial combat with venationes, animal hunts, that seemed less morally problematic despite their violence. They promoted chariot racing, which provided excitement without death, though accidents made this distinction sometimes theoretical. They encouraged theatrical performances and athletic competitions as alternative entertainments. The process took over a century, with gladiatorial games continuing sporadically until 435 AD, more than 100 years after Constantine's supposed condemnation. Dawn, in the empty arena. Morning light creeps across the sand of an abandoned amphitheatre, somewhere in Gaul, perhaps Lugdunum or Arelate, where grass now grows through cracks in the arena floor and birds nest in the vomitoria that once disgorged thousands of spectators. The year is sometime in the late 5th century, and the great killing grounds of the empire have fallen silent, their purpose forgotten, by generations who never witnessed the spectacles that once defined Roman civilization. The architecture remains impressive, even in decay. Stone arches still stand, defying time with Roman engineering's characteristic stubbornness. But the wooden seats have long since been scavenged for firewood, the bronze fixtures melted down for coinage, the marble facings stripped for building churches. What remains is skeleton, the bones of entertainment stripped of flesh and meaning. In the Hypogeum, where gladiators once waited for death or glory, rainwater pools in darkness. The mechanisms that lifted men and beasts into daylight have rusted beyond recognition, their purposes now mysterious to local inhabitants, who occasionally shelter here during storms. The cells that housed fighters serve as storage for a nearby monastery, filled with grain sacks where men once prepared for mortal combat. The transformation from violence to sustenance seems almost deliberately symbolic. Nature has begun its patient reclamation. Vines wrap around columns like green togas, their leaves rustling with the same sound that silk garments once made in these spaces. Wildflowers bloom where blood once pooled, their colours, purple, yellow, white, accidentally recreating the hierarchy of Roman social orders. In the highest tiers, where slaves and women once sat, young trees have taken root, their growth gradually prying apart the fitted stones. The silence here is profound, not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of forgetting. No one living remembers the roar of 50,000 voices, the clash of weapons, the dying prayers in dozen languages. The names of gladiators, carved by admirers into stone benches, are weathering away, leaving only mysterious scratches that might be decoration or accident. The history written in blood has been washed clean by centuries of rain. The last gladiators. The final recorded gladiatorial games in the Colosseum occurred in 435 AD, under Valentinian III, though by then they were shadows of their former glory, more historical reenactment than genuine blood sport. The gladiators who fought in these twilight exhibitions were not the highly trained professionals of earlier centuries, but volunteers performing choreographed demonstrations. Their combat as predetermined as modern professional wrestling, though still occasionally fatal through accident or excess enthusiasm. These last gladiators inhabited a transformed world where their profession had become anachronism. Christianity was now the empire's official religion, and bishops wielded more influence than generals. The economy that had supported gladiatorial schools had collapsed along with long-distance trade. The infrastructure of death, the training facilities, the supply chains for exotic animals, the medical specialists who treated combat wounds, had been repurposed or abandoned. What remained were individual fighters, often aging veterans, who knew no other trade, performing in diminished venues for diminishing audiences. The social status of these final gladiators was paradoxically higher than their predecessors. No longer infames, legally prohibited from respectable society. They were treated more like actors or athletes, not entirely respectable, but not utterly beyond redemption. Some were even Christians themselves, justifying their profession through increasingly tortured theological arguments about providing moral instruction through allegorical combat. The venues had shrunk along with the spectacles. Where once the Colosseum held 80,000, these final games might draw a few hundred nostalgic aristocrats and curious citizens. The elaborate staging, flooded arenas, exotic beasts, massive architectural sets, was financially impossible. Instead, a simple platform in a forum or courtyard sufficed, with basic weapons and minimal ceremony. Yet something essential persisted in these final exhibitions. The fundamental human fascination with violence, the visceral thrill of watching bodies in conflict, the psychological release of experiencing danger vicariously. None of this disappeared with Christianity's triumph. It simply transformed, finding new expressions in public executions that remained popular spectacles, in elaborate passion plays depicting martyrdoms, in the increasingly violent sports that replaced gladiatorial combat. The very last gladiators were perhaps those who never entered an arena at all, the instructors in Constantinople who taught Byzantine nobles sword fighting using gladiatorial techniques, calling themselves by the old names while serving entirely different purposes. They preserved the physical knowledge, the footwork, the blade angles, the defensive postures, while forgetting the cultural context that gave these movements meaning. They were living museums, embodying traditions whose significance they could no longer fully articulate. When the last man who had actually fought as a gladiator died, probably sometime in the early 6th century, a direct link to classical antiquity was severed. No written manual could capture the visceral reality of facing death for entertainment. No theatrical reenactment could reproduce the specific tension of uncertain survival. The gladiatorial tradition, which had endured for 7 centuries, ended not with dramatic abolition, but with quiet forgetting. You walk through ruins. You stand in the Colosseum on a November afternoon in the present day, your ticket purchased online, your path regulated by metal barriers and multilingual signs warning against climbing on the ancient stones. Around you, thousands of tourists raise phones to capture images that will be compressed, uploaded, and forgotten. The magnitude of what happened here seems impossible to grasp through the mediation of guided tours and gift shop reproductions. The arena floor is gone, exposing the hypogeum's maze-like passages below. You can see where the elevators operated, where animals were caged, where gladiators made their final preparations. But without the wooden planking, the sand, the smell of blood and sweat, these are merely archaeological features, as emotionally distant as architectural blueprints. The space that once held visceral terror now hosts educational plaques in 6 languages. You climb worn stairs to the upper tiers, your feet following grooves carved by millions of ancient spectators. From this height, you can see modern Rome sprawling in all directions. Apartment blocks, traffic circles, television antennas. The city has grown around and over its violent heart, incorporating the Colosseum into its daily geography while forgetting its original purpose. Joggers run past outside. Couples take wedding photographs against its walls. Street vendors sell plastic gladiator helmets made in China. The emotional disconnect is jarring. You know intellectually that approximately 400,000 people died here over 3.5 centuries. That's more than the entire population of many modern cities. Each death witnessed, cheered, evaluated for entertainment value. Yet the number remains abstract, impossible to internalize. You cannot reconcile the pleasant Mediterranean sunshine with systematic murder, the tourists' cheerful chatter with dying screams. Something shifts when you notice the small details. Graffiti scratched into stone by ancient spectators. Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh. A narrow passage worn smooth by countless hands gripping for support. The particular angle of seating that would have given perfect view of a sword thrust. These human-scale remnants pierce through temporal distance, creating moments of uncomfortable intimacy with people who watch death for pleasure. You wonder about moral progress, whether humanity has genuinely evolved beyond arena violence or merely transformed it. You think of action movies with their choreographed killing, video games where death is entertainment, news broadcasts that linger on tragedy. The technology has changed, the physical distance increased, but the fundamental appetite that filled the Colosseum perhaps remains, sanitized and digitized, but essentially unchanged. Echoes in popular culture. The gladiator's journey from historical figure to cultural archetype traces a peculiar path through Western imagination, accumulating layers of meaning that often contradict historical reality while revealing deep truths about how successive eras have understood violence, honor, and spectacle. From Jean-Léon Gérôme's 19th century paintings to Ridley Scott's digital recreations, each generation has reimagined gladiators to reflect contemporary anxieties about civilization and barbarism. The 19th century Romantic movement transformed gladiators into noble savages, tragic figures whose natural virtue was corrupted by decadent civilization. Gérôme's polis verso fixed in popular imagination, the image of the emperor's turned thumb, condemning a defeated fighter, though the actual gesture remains historically uncertain. These paintings emphasized individual heroism over systemic violence, making gladiators safe for Victorian consumption by focusing on their courage while minimizing their slavery. Early Hollywood embraced gladiators as vehicles for exploring forbidden desires within acceptable historical distance. Films like Spartacus used ancient Rome to critique contemporary issues, slavery, political corruption, sexual liberation, that couldn't be addressed directly under production codes. The arena became a space where violence could be shown explicitly because it was educational, where male bodies could be displayed erotically because it was historical, where rebellion could be celebrated because it was safely in the past. Modern depictions have grown simultaneously more accurate in material details and more fantastical in narrative scope. Computer graphics can recreate the Colosseum, stone by stone. Yet the stories told within these precise reconstructions bear little resemblance to historical, gladiatorial life. The gladiator has become a superhero archetype, possessed of impossible fighting skills and anachronistic modern values, typically seeking freedom through violence in ways that would have puzzled actual Roman fighters. Video games have created the most direct connection between modern audiences and gladiatorial experience, allowing players to embody fighters making life or death decisions in virtual arenas. These games reveal uncomfortable truths about the appeal of arena violence, the power fantasy of physical dominance, the clarity of binary outcomes, the satisfaction of clear hierarchies based on skill. They suggest that the psychological mechanisms that filled ancient amphitheatres remain latent, awaiting only appropriate activation. The gladiator metaphor has penetrated business language, sports commentary, and political discourse. Executives are gladiators in arena meetings. Athletes are warriors displaying killer instinct. Politicians enter blood sport elections. This linguistic appropriation sanitizes historical violence while revealing how competitive contemporary society has become. We have democratized the gladiatorial experience, making everyone a potential combatant in metaphorical arenas. Professional wrestling represents perhaps the most direct descendant of gladiatorial games, combining athletic performance with theatrical narrative, real danger with predetermined outcomes. Like ancient Munera, it provides working-class audiences with spectacles of violence that acknowledge their entertainment nature while maintaining sufficient reality to satisfy psychological needs for authentic conflict. The parallels extend to details: distinctive fighting personas, signature moves, crowd participation in determining outcomes, the transformation of athletes into celebrities, despite or because of their association with low entertainment. the paradox resolved. The gladiator's paradox. Simultaneously slave and celebrity, despised and admired, worthless and valuable, was never truly a contradiction, but rather the perfect expression of Rome's essential nature. A civilization that conquered through disciplined violence, that maintained peace through threatened force, that defined citizenship through military service, would inevitably create an entertainment form that crystallized these values into spectacular display. The arena was not an aberration from Roman virtue, but its logical culmination. The gladiatorial system resolved fundamental tensions within Roman society by externalizing them into controlled combat. The anxiety about empires corrupting wealth was addressed by watching desperate men fight for survival. The fear of slave revolt was exercised through regular demonstrations of violence against the enslaved. The questioning of Roman military superiority was answered by repeated victories over foreign fighting styles. The arena provided a space where uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and human nature could be acknowledged within acceptable frameworks. Modern discomfort with gladiatorial games often stems from their honesty about violence, rather than the violence itself. Contemporary society has not eliminated the spectacle of death, but has disguised it through technological mediation and moral justification. We conduct wars through drone strikes witnessed on screens, making killing as abstract as video games. We consume endless fictional violence while maintaining that we are more civilized than those who watched actual death. We have not transcended the arena, we have simply virtualized it. The gladiator's transformation from person to symbol reveals how societies metabolize their own contradictions. What began as human sacrifice for religious purposes became entertainment, then political tool, then moral crisis, and finally cultural metaphor. Each transformation preserved essential elements while discarding others, creating palimpsests of meaning that obscure origins while maintaining emotional resonance. The gladiator remains powerful as symbol precisely because the underlying tensions he embodied between civilization and barbarism, control and chaos, individual and collective, remain unresolved. The lessons of the arena extend beyond simple condemnation of ancient brutality. They reveal how entertainment and power intertwine, how spectacle can simultaneously reinforce and subvert social order, how the boundary between civilization and savagery is maintained through careful performance rather than absolute difference. The gladiator's raised sword asks not whether we are capable of violence. History provides that answer repeatedly, but how we choose to channel, display, and understand the violence that remains endemic to human society. Perhaps the truest resolution of the gladiatorial paradox lies in recognizing that it was never meant to be resolved, but rather perpetually performed. Each fight was a question about values, survival, courage, and mercy that received temporary answers through combat, but required constant reiteration. The arena provided not solutions but process, not answers but methods for continuing to ask essential questions about human nature and social order. As we stand in the ruins of amphitheaters or watch cinematic recreations of arena combat, we participate in this ongoing interrogation. Our fascination with gladiators reflects not primitive bloodlust, but sophisticated recognition that the questions they embodied, how power should be displayed, how violence should be controlled, how individual worth relates to social value, had remained urgent and unresolved. The gladiator's ghost haunts not because we have transcended what he represented, but because we have merely transformed it into shapes we find more comfortable to contemplate. The sands of the arena have long since scattered to the winds, the blood washed away by centuries of rain, the cheers and screams faded into silence. Yet something essential persists in the stones of ruined amphitheatres and the stories we continue to tell about those who fought within them. The gladiator remains our dark mirror, reflecting aspects of human nature we simultaneously celebrate and condemn, revealing the violent foundations beneath civilization's polished surface. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will dream of standing in the arena's center, feeling the weight of armor you've never worn, gripping a sword you've never held, facing an opponent who exists only in imagination. In that dream space between waking consciousness and full surrender to sleep, you might understand something essential about the gladiator's experience. Not the historical details of combat technique or social status, but the fundamental human experience of facing mortality with whatever courage can be summoned, of performing identity under ultimate pressure, of discovering what remains when everything unnecessary has been stripped away. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. May the tranquil flow of time carry you to peaceful rest.